Good afternoon and welcome to Stock Talk. My name is Shawn Cabak and I will be your host. Manitoba Agriculture is offering a series of livestock and forage webinars to help Manitoba beef producers. These webinars will run monthly until April. We're glad you can join us for today's presentations, which will be recorded so you can view them at a future date. If you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to submit them by typing them in on your computer or smartphone. January has been a busy month with beef and forage days last week at 3 locations in Manitoba. The meetings were well attended. If you couldn't make it out and were interested in any of the presentations, we can send you additional info. And next week is Ag Days in Brandon, which is always well attended, running from January 21st to 23rd. Through the Sustainable Ag Manitoba program, producers can apply for beneficial management practice funding under cropland management, livestock and manure management, and water management. The cost sharing would cover such improvements as reduced tillage, low disturbance placement of seed and fertilizer, composting, tile drainage, water supply development, forages on sensitive soils, and more. And the application intake is now open until February the 11th. Another Sustainable Canadian Ag Partnership Program that was new last year and is continuing for this year is funding for the Livestock Predation Prevention Program. So producers can get funding for predator-resistant fence construction, including fencing around their calving area, or if they want to set up a composting pen. So today we have a full agenda with 3 presentations. And to start off, we will hear a Manitoba Ag Crownland update from Grant Palmer, who works with policy with the Crownlands program with Manitoba Agriculture. So I'd like to welcome Grant.
Thanks, Shawn. Hear me all right?
Sounds good.
All right. Uh, Sorry, folks. Do I need to do something to make my slides visible?
Just share your screen.
Share.
So new share.
Okay.
There you go. Now we can see it.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Shawn. So, yeah, Grant Palmer, I work with Crown Lands. I've been with them for about a couple of years. I take care of some of the kind of the background policy stuff. I'm not the person you talk to when you're calling about a lease, but with many of the revisions that we've had kind of on the regulatory level, that's where I'm spending my time. So I want to give a background on the program and some of the leases and some of the latest information I can provide um, on what we're up to. So the goals of the Crown Lands program are here. We want to support sustainable expansion of the livestock herd in Manitoba. I realize we may not be expanding much these days, but it's an industry that's important to the province and to the ag economy. And Crown Lands is something the government can do to support that. There's a number of ecological goods and services that Crown Lands provides, including climate change mitigation and adaptation. And the province does have a treaty land entitlement obligation that needs to be supported. And because the ag Crown Land is Crown Land, there are a number of steps that have to be taken to address those provincial obligations. So where does Crown Lands fit in? Manitoba has about 400,000 cows. I think it's probably less than that. Keep hearing about how the breeding cow herd is declining, and certainly with some of the prices, that's we keep hearing about cows going to auction. So we may be at between 350 and 400,000 cows. We think around 75,000 or 85,000 cows make their way to Ag Crown Land. So that is kind of a number that we've derived off of the productive capacity of the land under lease. So very basically, I think that maybe 20% of the cows in Manitoba make their way to Crown land. We have around 2,000 ag Crown land clients. There are about 10,000 land parcels of, varying sizes and productivity. Um, so ag Crown land is really provincially owned land that has an agricultural code on it. So as opposed to other codes, there's about 2.2 million acres that have potential kind of agricultural capability, or 2.2 million has an ag code on it. Of that, 1.45 million are under active cropping or forage disposition. And that probably that 2.2 number uh, gives us 600,000 animal unit months. So I'll get into what an animal unit month is. We have around closer to 500,000 animal unit months under lease. So what's an animal unit month? It's important to know this because it's what you're billed on. We bill on animal unit months. The rent that you might see us charging is based on an animal unit month. And what that is, it really represents the amount of forage required by one animal unit for 1 month is an animal unit month. The animal unit's defined as a 1,000 pound beef cow with or without a calf, and a daily requirement of 26 pounds of dry matter. So one animal unit month for a whole month is 780 pounds of dry matter. Now, when it comes to how do we know how much feed is out there, it's variable by, year to year. Um, it's based on what an average year for that parcel would produce. So we have a parcel that's got this many acres. Of the total acres, this much has trees, this much is swamp, this much is upland forage, um, and based on some calculating, we come up with an animal unit month or a productivity number for that parcel. And then the rent is based on that. What a producer does with that is up to them. We want to know that it's being used, but we're not tracking any information on how it's being used, and its use doesn't immediately contribute to the productivity or the animal unit months of the parcel. So just to talk a bit about the types of leases we have. So we're largely in the forage lease business. Most of the land is under a forage lease, so that's for grazing or haying, and it's a long-term, a lease or permit, long-term basis for haying or grazing. So right now, because of the regulatory changes that we've seen since kind of 2019 until now, there's really two common types of leases. The first one is the modern lease, what we call a modern lease because those are leases that have been issued since 2019. They have a 15-year term. Now, those are in contrast to maybe what people are more familiar with is a legacy lease, and this is a lease that was allocated before 2019, which is essentially lifetime. The term is, it's yours until you're 65 years old, and then you can renew it 15 years at a time after that. We also have cropping leases used for annual cropping. These are for annual crops, wheat, canola. These are, parcels we have that it ended up as Crown land, but have a higher kind of ag capability. So they can be used for annual cropping. Forage leases, you are not allowed to plant annual crops on them. They're forage only. Cropping leases are 5 years at a time, not 15 years at a time, 5 years at a time. We also have a renewable permit, hay or grazing on land with no, maybe where the legal description is less clear. It might also be land restricted by land use guidelines for annual production, and these are It's a 15-year permit. It's a 1 year term, but it's renewable automatically for 15 years. We issue some casual permits, short-term dispositions, hay or grazing on land when we haven't had time to advertise them properly, or it could be for emergency use. So it shouldn't be casual in perpetuity. There's usually a reason it's only a short-term permit. And we have a number of special leases. These are long-term leases used for existing and unique leases. Some examples are the Brandon Research Center and Manitoba Beef and Forage initiatives. Some information about rent. Maybe you've seen uh, news releases recently. 2025 rates will be frozen. No change from 2024. So that number is going to be $3.66 per AUM. Roughly, that works out to about $22.50 per cow-calf pair. To convert that, we just simply use a factor of 1.35. So we know that a lot of breeding cows aren't 1,000 pounds. They're heavier than that. So we use 1350 as a kind of a benchmark. And I think 4.5 months of use gets us to that 2250 per pair. So still seems like a very reasonable price on a per head basis. The reason for the rent freeze is to continue to support producers and maintain affordability of ag crown land. For this year, because of the postal strike, the payments are going to be due February 15th, as opposed to in a normal year, it would be January 1st. And for every parcel, property tax has to be paid in addition to the rent. So in 2024, in January 1st, 2024, there were some regulatory changes that came into effect. The changes were driven largely by requests from leaseholders. Maybe the most notable one is the nominations for legacy leases. This is kind of the there's no more unit transfers of legacy leases. There's only nominations. So if you're a legacy leaseholder, you can apply for a nomination certificate, which will allow you to, if granted, you'll be allowed to name the next leaseholder. So if kind of the textbook example is someone's got some deeded land on the farm on their farm that they decide that they're going to sell, and they have been users of Crown land during the farm career, and they want the buyer of the deeded land to take over the leased land. So what the nomination does is it's a mechanism for them to do that. The major difference between the nomination and a unit transfer is the new leaseholder won't get a legacy lease. They will be issued a modern lease, a 15-year lease. So they won't get the lifetime lease. They'll get a new modern lease. There's an application process for nominations. So you would apply for the nomination certificate. If approved, you would be issued the certificate, and then at that point, you could name the succeeding leaseholder. So at the time of application, you don't have to tell us who it is you're intending to pass the lease on to. As part of the application, our department has to conduct what's called an initial assessment for duty to consult. So this means that we need to assess if there are any Aboriginal or treaty rights that may be affected by the nomination. This is something that we're required to do, largely because it's not a change in use of the land. The previous leaseholder was grazing cattle on it. The next leaseholder plans to graze cattle on it. Generally, they don't result in much impact. So duty to consult means that we're consulting with any concerned First Nations that may be affected by a change to land or land use. And the duty to consult process is simply a question that we need to ask. And the question is there any reason to consult with any possibly current concerned communities? Largely, the answer is no, because there's no change in land use. Also part of the nomination process, any land for which an application is made, we have to circulate that land for treaty land entitlement. So that means that any treaty land entitlement eligible First Nations would have the opportunity to select parcels that are being applied for on that nomination. So it's possible if they select them, these parcels would be removed from the lease. And any remaining parcels can continue on through the nomination process. Now, we're unable to indicate if there's interest in that land for selection through treaty land entitlement. But we do have this. The treaty land entitlement is something that Ag Crown Lands deals with regularly and has for some time. And I think I can say that the selections are not widespread on Ag Crown land. We do have some. There are selections over the years, but relatively few relative to the land that has been circulated. Moving on. So as part of the regulatory changes in 2024, the modern leases that had been issued since 2019 can be transferred. They're wide open transfers. You can transfer those to any eligible leaseholder, and the transferee would hold that lease for the remainder of the lease. So if it was issued in 2020 and you transferred it in 2025, that lease would still have 10 years to go to the transferee. There's a 5-year extension possible for holders of modern leases. So like I just mentioned, that 15-year lease, if a leaseholder was to provide a forage management plan, they could receive a 5-year extension to the 15-year lease, making it a 20-year lease. Now, we don't need to see that forage management plan until the end of the lease. So if you, 2019, if you were issued a lease in 2019, in 2034, or 2033, maybe the year ahead with some notice, if you were to provide that forage management plan and you could demonstrate that this forage management plan was reasonably followed, you would be eligible for a 5-year extension. It feels like we're quite a ways away from having to deal with forage management plans yet. And finally, improvement compensation and appraisal. So what also came into effect, if you are surrendering a lease and it's going to go back to allocation and you want to be paid for improvements you've made on the land, you must hire a certified appraiser, obtain an appraisal provided to Ag Crown Lands, and that value for the improvements would be included in any allocation process with the intention to inform any interested future leaseholders on the value that they would have to provide to the next leaseholder. I feel like I'm running out of time. Pick it up here. A few more. The forage capacity would be determined at the beginning of the lease. Oh, there's that bullet again about the forage management plan. There's unlimited transfers of renewable leases. Yeah, I'll just skip that one because I feel like I've hit all of those points. So 2025 allocations, what's coming up? Cropping lease auction is scheduled for the week of February 24th to 28th. That's cropping leases only. There's going to be no forage leases and permits auction for 2025. So with the recent significant program changes, we're taking some more time to review the effectiveness of the changes, and we'll be, continuing to determine future program priorities. So that work is ongoing, and there won't be any lease or permit auction for 2025. Finally, there's more information on all of this at the Ag Crown Lands website. So there is a link there. And as far as the new regulatory changes go, there's a number of policies there. If you want more information on how all this stuff works, there's links to each of them there. So that's all, Shawn. That's all the slides I have. I can answer some questions if you like.
Sure. So you indicated there's no forage lease auctions in 25. Going
Correct.
forward after that, are we going to go back to the auction process? Do do we know yet, I guess, or
We
is that
don't.
still up to be decided?
To be determined, yeah.
Okay, because prior to that, it was done on a point system and
Correct, yeah.
it was changed to the auction system. So
Yeah. Yeah.
still stay tuned, I guess, how it will be determined.
That you got it.
Okay, good. No, that's some useful information that you provided on some of the changes to the Crown Land program. Thank you for that, Grant. And just going to check with Pam to see if she has any questions. Just like to remind participants, if you do have any questions, you can type them into the Q&A on your screen.
There are no questions at the moment.
All right, great. Thanks, Grant. So next we will hear about forages to improve soil health. There's been a lot of talk about how perennial forages are important for carbon sequestration, and with climate change, that's becoming a more important topic every day. So to talk about improving soil health with forages, we have Marla Riekman. She's a soil specialist with Manitoba Agriculture. Welcome, Marla.
Thank you, Shawn. Okay, so this will be kind of high level, I guess, in a way, just to talk about forages and where they kind of fit in terms of managing things like soil health, and where we're looking for some of those improvements, or at least highlighting where forages can make a big difference in terms of general things like soil health. Um, so when we talk about soil health, and I often will have a slide such as this, or many people have seen this before, we talk about the different functions of soil. So we have physical, chemical, and biological functions within the soil. And within that, there's a lot of different things that we're looking at, whether it's, chemical analysis, in the physical stuff, soil compaction, water infiltration, things that you can think about, physical movements within the soil. And physical things that you can kind of see and feel within the soil. And then the biological stuff, including things like potentially mineralizable nitrogen coming out of organic matter in the soil, that percent organic matter, things like biological respiration. These are all really critical components to soil health. And when we talk about these things kind of working together, some of the things that I often talk about is things like organic matter and aggregate stability as being some of those critical pieces that we're looking for when we talk about soil health. So organic matter, while we have that listed as a biological function, it's something that is influenced by and influences also the physical and chemical functions of the soil. So it's a critical component we think about in the soil tests or in kind of soil functions. And the other one is aggregate stability. So aggregate stability may also think of that as being a physical component of the soil because aggregates is listed there. Without the chemical components and the biological functions of the soil, you don't have stable aggregates. So the building of the aggregates comes from that basic kind of chemical structure of soil with clays interacting with divalent cations like calcium, magnesium, that sort of thing. And then you add in things like the glues and such that come from organic matter and root exudates and things that can help stick things together. And that's where those aggregates build and then are becoming stable because of those functions together. So forages have a big component in terms of what they can provide in terms of these soil health things, because they're really looking at adding a lot to these principles of soil health. So when we talk about soil health, there's 5 general principles that get thrown around. And they are keeping soil covered, minimizing disturbance, maintaining plant diversity, having living roots or plants in the soil, and then integrating livestock. And while a lot of crop producers may be looking at doing a lot of these things without the livestock functionality in it, forages really cover off everything in this case. So if you're looking at things like keeping soil covered and minimizing disturbance, that comes from having that forage in place. Because again, we're not tilling the soil and working the soil the same in terms of the soil disturbance happening during forage years. That plant diversity may be coming from those mixes. So that would, of course, be mixed forages rather than, just single species forage stands. And then you've got that living root or plant in the soil for a longer period of time. So you get a lot of benefit from having, whether it's water uptake during that period of time, just root growth that happens during that period of time, that sort of thing. And finally, that forage has a function to be able to integrate livestock. So it's either you've got livestock grazing the forage, you're cutting that forage to feed livestock, maybe putting manure back onto that land. So that's how that integration can happen. So I'm going to break it down to kind of some of the key components that I see in terms of forages being influential for soil health, keeping in mind those 5 soil health principles. So things like building soil structure, erosion management, salinity management, and compaction management, because these are things that are oftentimes major issues that farmers face in terms of soil health issues. And we kind of forget about them sometimes, even though they're these big picture things. We think beyond them sometimes. If we don't think about how to manage these very basic issues like soil structure, compaction, salinity, and erosion, we can't really go beyond to look past those things to improve soil health if we're not kind of improving the first line that we need to focus on. So soil structure, I mentioned before, is really heavily influenced by things like organic material, organic matter, even just the clay content in the soil, that those divalent cations, calcium, magnesium, they are the building blocks of soil structure because they actually flocculate or draw clays together through these charges. And the soil structure ends up being how sand, silt, and clays are arranged. So it's not the texture of the soil in terms of the percent sand and silt and clay, but it's the structure that comes from how these things are arranged into some kind of 3D view or version of itself. So you've got these aggregates and you've got pores and you have all these spaces then in between. And these are the things that then can create those influences on water movement, water holding capacity. So big pores moving water through the soil, small pores holding on to water, the biological activity, the root growth, the seedling emergence, all of these things are really important when it comes to how soils support plant structures. Biological activity, I often will say, like, you can support all the bugs you want, but if you don't give them a good home to live in, then you can't actually add more, right? So we have to have good soil structure for them to have a good home to live in. They need air and they need water access. And so they need to have non-compacted soils in order to function in. Now, of course, there are some microbes and things like the denitrifiers we talk about that function in wet soils. That's great. They can function that way, but those aren't the ones we want to foster in our soils because those are the ones that are actually detrimental in terms of losing nitrogen to the atmosphere. Soil aggregation, or those structures, they can decrease the risk of erosion, and they become what we refer to as that #1 natural defense against compaction. So the better structured your soil, the better off we are in terms of, again, managing some of these other soil health related issues. So this is just a general look at what soils with high organic matter look like versus low organic matter in terms of the stability of these aggregates. So in these containers, they've got dry soil and wet soil, either with a high organic matter where those aggregates are kind of holding their size or shape a little bit better. Whereas when you put low organic matter soils, those aggregates into water, the water will kind of rush into the pores within those aggregates and slough them apart or make them fall apart. And when that happens, then the soils just can't withstand things like heavy rains and things without sealing up. So that can be very problematic in some soils. Now we have to keep in mind that not all soils can build high organic matter. Sands don't build organic matter or aggregates very well. So we're talking about soils that, thinking about their potential to build organic matter and build stable aggregates, but knowing that some soils are more limited in terms of what that basic chemical structure of that soil is. The other thing that comes with these pore channels that allow water to flow through is these root channels, or what we call biopores. And some of these biopores could also be left behind by, earthworm movement and other nematodes and things moving through the soil. So I like to say that plants are lazy. I'm a soils person, so I get a little down on plants sometimes. And plants are lazy, and they're going to take the path of least resistance. And we find this quite often in heavily compacted soils that, there's areas where if you open up a crack or a space where the roots can actually grow in, they grow on a plane. They've exploited those spaces, but they're not punching through the compacted area. And we need to keep that in mind that roots can only do so much, but when a space opens up, they actually will move into those spaces and exploit them and can actually break them down even farther. So things like biopores or root channels in the soil, if we leave the soil untilled or unworked and aren't disconnecting the top to the bottom in terms of like shearing off the top of that channel and disconnecting it to the surface, we're really helping to build soils that can infiltrate water better. And again, in a forage situation, these roots kind of grow, they die back, they grow, they die back. They create a lot of these spaces, which can be very beneficial for future future plant growth and again, water movement through those soils. Another one is decreased risk of erosion. And from a very basic standpoint, if you've got perennials in, you're not tilling. And so during those years that a perennial stand is in, for whatever length of time it's in, we don't have tillage erosion happening. The photo on the left and the bottom is a soil that has been obviously tilled quite heavily over years. And those light colored soils on the hilltops are actually a result of tillage erosion, where the active tillage has dragged the topsoil down to the bottom of the hill, and there's no topsoil remaining on the top of that soil surface or on the top of those hills. And that's kind of the basic, a very important form of erosion that we don't talk about often enough because we think about wind and water erosion, but tillage erosion itself is a really a key player in this game. The other thing about the forage itself is it's providing both a cover and an anchor. So when we talked about those first two principles of, maintaining soil armor or cover and, reducing soil disturbance, the cover is decreasing things like wind erosion or like potentially water erosion. And also the anchor comes in having those roots in place to be able to anchor that soil and help with that soil structure to hold the soil particles so they can't wash away as easily. But we need to kind of keep in mind that sometimes when we're faced with really extreme moisture events, like we have seen a number of times, in the last few years, when we have these major events, we might not be able to overcome things completely. And I think it's always an important aspect when we're talking about things like soil health, that we can't just always assume that when you take these practices into play, that they are going to fix the problem and stop the erosion potential from happening. That photo in the center is during the 2011 flood. There was major water runs, and in some cases cut through areas that were not had not been seeded or were on kind of grass waterway areas, and still had massive gullies cut. It's hard to tell from that photo what the perspective or what the depth of that gully actually is. There's other photos that John Hurd had taken of me standing in that gully, and it was a good 5 feet deep, if not deeper in some of those spaces. So again, you can't expect that just because it's in a forage, it's going to protect from something that is that extreme. But in terms of milder risks of erosion, absolutely. Another big key factor for me is salinity management. So when we talk about salinity, we're thinking about things like high water tables, high amounts of evaporation that exceed infiltration of water. So more upward movement rather than downward movement of water. And then you've got plants that are susceptible to soil salinity. So if you're trying to grow annual crops in a saline area that just can't, forage is going to be the solution for you. So there's a lot of benefits to the idea of using forages, even within the landscape of annually cropped land, in order to try to gain annual land back, let's say, by minimizing those saline areas with the use of forages. Now, this is another salinity issue. I often joke that the kochia that's in the center of this photo is not a problem that I'm going to be able to talk to anybody about, because that's definitely an issue, but it's not, that one's not specifically salinity related. But if you look in terms of the extent of this area, this is an area that maybe could be managed a little differently in order to decrease some of that kochia. And everybody's concerned about kochia and wanting to focus on things like kochia management. One of the things that I find fascinating is that a lot of farmers I've started to talk to, and I was just recently in Minnesota speaking to a few farmers about some of these issues, and someone said, oh yeah, I've been baling this stuff up. He bales up kochia before it goes to seed. It's got really great feed value. The cattle love it. And what it does is it keeps the plant growing in a vegetative manner, which means it's taking up more water, helping to draw down that water table. And that's without having, that's like considering your kochia being an annual forage in this case, rather than actually seeding it to a forage. Using this and then looking at maybe having to put in a forage over time to decrease the saline creep or decrease the size of this patch would be beneficial. But there are some first steps when we're dealing with situations like this. If we have to get to a point where we need to look at seeding forages, there's a wide range of salinity tolerance levels. And I'm just going to go like this. If you see on the left-hand column, you'll note that these numbers are all going to be cut in half. And that's just because the lab test that you get on your soil test from the commercial lab is usually a 1-to-1 soil to water test. And it's about half of what the salt tolerance test is that the researchers use. So I take those numbers and I divide them by 2 just so you can compare them. But if you've got, low levels of salinity, maybe you can get away with things like a salt tolerant alfalfa or, brome grass, meadow fescue, something that you could actually, not have to go to a really high salt tolerant crop. I will note that alfalfa tends to be, even if it's a salt tolerant alfalfa, it tends to not love salinity during the time that it's being established. And so it may take a bit of time before it actually gets going in a higher saline area, even if it is considered to be a more or less salt tolerant variety. And then highlighted in red in the top level here, I have AC Saltlander. Now, of course, that one was developed out of the Swift Current Salt Lab, and it has a great potential and high palatability, great potential for growing in extreme salinity areas. But that being said, it takes many years to establish. And one of the things that you have to think about if you're utilizing a forage in saline areas is that it may take a lot of time for it to get started and get going. So we can't just assume that you can throw the seed in and you're harvesting a decent forage in 2 years or so. The forage yield will get bigger and bigger over time, but it may take 3-4 years before it looks like you're really getting anything out of it. So it's something to keep in mind. A lot of these, even though they're salt tolerant forages, they're still really slow to get going. And then my last one here or issue to bring forward is around compaction and compaction management. And we often think about the fact that roots in the soil should be able to alleviate compaction. And I go back to that slide that I previously talked about with the roots channels, the biopores in it. And the reason I bring that one up is because while you can have these root channels or biopores as being something that's really helpful to look at and understand that, the roots can open up space, those roots can still only put so much pressure on compacted soils. And so to the idea that a perennial forage or a forage can go in and fix compaction, yes, it could be beneficial. It will take bit of time for that to happen. You need to have a longer period of growth because as roots kind of work their way into those spaces, they can exude the acids and stuff to kind of start to break up some of those soils, but it takes a lot of time. And we also have to recognize that some compaction is human induced. A number of years ago, or I shouldn't say that, some compaction is naturally existing, not human induced. So a number of years ago, our Manitoba Soil Science Society had our annual tour up into Arborg region, and we were in a field that was an alfalfa field that was on a soil that has natural density to it. So it's a naturally compacted soil at depth. It's just a nature of the property of that soil makes it quite compacted. And that alfalfa, while we always recognize should, root 15 or so feet deep, That alfalfa rooted 2 feet deep, and that was it, because below that 2-foot depth, there was those naturally compacted soils and it did not break its way through. So we have to recognize that the plants are limited to how much compaction they can actually grow through. The one benefit, though, when it comes to having a perennial forage or something growing in that field is reducing susceptibility for compaction if it means that you've got more soil drying happening. Our compaction tends to happen when our soils are moist, not so much when they're really, really wet. But having soils being dried down because of the growth of that plant can be really helpful. More water uptake means lowering the water table. That's another thing that helps on the salinity side. But they may be able to help you traffic on a soil that has higher moisture because, again, that root is kind of creating that roadbed in a way. But that being said, we have to remember that the timing and the type of traffic that we have on perennial fields can still be an issue. Some of the most compacted soils I've ever been on have been old alfalfa stands, and I say that loosely because it's that alfalfa stand that has like one alfalfa crown left every once in a while and is mostly grass. But because they've been hayed and they're trafficked multiple times, usually with smaller tractors, skinnier tires, they don't float over the alfalfa or the forage as much. They can be very, very tight and very compacted soil. So again, yes, they can help alleviate or reduce susceptibility, but still can have to work within the limits of what that soil can actually handle. And I just throw this up as a reminder in terms of how long-term this compaction issue can be. So even, and this isn't an annual crop situation, so it's not a perennial situation to alleviate it, but we have heavy equipment on the right-hand side had been trafficked 29 years prior to these little, think of them as like a soil x-ray, showing the white areas, which is where the pore spaces are, versus the plot that had been non-compacted. Both of them were handled with light equipment for that 29-year period. So the compacted versus not compacted, you can see there's still a really big loss of pore space on the field that had been heavily compacted even after almost 30 years. Okay, and so don't forget the influence of soil type. Again, type of soil can kind of influence the overall health of the soil. Soil texture is important. All of these help for whether or not it's going to build aggregates or build organic matter. Sands just don't have the same capacity as say, the clays and the clay loams do. Again, because they influence water holding capacity, yield potential, biomass growth, all of that, it's really hard for a sand that just can't grow as much plant material to build up a whole lot of organic matter because plant material is necessary for that to happen. We always have to think about, we're comparing soil health ability or soil health capabilities for one soil versus another. Clays and sands are very, very different. It's like comparing apples and oranges. Generally speaking, though, we're talking about trying to use management strategies, in this case, something like forages as a management practice. They can really build soil health and can be a big part of that long-term profitability and long-term sustainability of the soil management. But we also recognize that these forages need to fit into the overall farming system. So while a group like this that's listening right now is already very into the idea of forages, other people might not have the ability, if they're annual crop producers, they may not have the ability to, harvest and graze and manage those forages the same. And again, anytime we're looking at trying to increase any soil health benefit, we can't expect the practices to be seen overnight. It takes a long time before we can actually see these things change, because soil does not change that fast. And so we never have quick fixes when it comes to that. So that's what I have for slides. And if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thanks, Marla, for the talk on forages to improve soil health. I guess a couple questions that I had was, how long does it take to improve soil organic matter? I know it takes quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
The second question,
okay,
is the role that polycrops maybe play in that, or how well polycrops can improve soil health?
Okay, so I would say on the soil organic matter one, when we're talking about the improvement of soil organic matter, we're often thinking that, we may see, depending on the practice, we may see these things go up like 1% over 15 to 20 years. If you're ever seeing organic matter increase a lot faster than that, it can be not necessarily due to the soil changing, but more the soil additives being kind of considered within that test. So something like a soil organic matter test is burning off all organic material that has made it through the sieve essentially when they're doing the soil test. So they take that soil, they dry it down, they weigh it, they burn it essentially, and then they weigh it again, and all the organic material will have burnt off. So that's how they would end up looking at that test. And if you've got fine root hairs or there's manure incorporated in that might be kind of a part of the soil itself, it's not necessarily accounted for as being a true stabilized organic matter. So there's a difference, in my opinion, between organic material that's been added to the system and true soil organic matter. And that sometimes is elevated if we're seeing those numbers go up faster than they should. Because from a purely kind of scientific, calculatable manner, you shouldn't actually be able to see soil carbon, which is 58% of the soil organic matter, go up that quickly because there hasn't been enough carbon added into the system. In terms of polycrops, I don't have enough data to know whether the poly versus monocrop is going to make a big difference. There have been some kind of general studies looking at like metadata of all of the different studies, and they haven't really found that there's a huge benefit to having like a polycrop versus a monocrop in the grand scheme of things. There may be some cases where the benefit was there, but in terms of all of the data, when they look at all of the different projects, not necessarily seeing a huge difference between.
Okay, thanks, Marla. Pam, did you have anything else for Marla?
There's no questions right now.
Okay, great. Thanks, Marla.
No problem.
So our next presentation, we'll look at the Manitoba Pasture Forage and Water Survey results. This was done in the fall of 24. And so Manitoba Agriculture conducted a pasture forage survey with producers across the province to determine the feed quality and mineral status. 43 samples were sampled from late August to mid-September, and these pastures consisted of continuous to stockpile to rotational grazing systems, and forage quality ranged from mature forage to young regrowth, tame, native, and grass legume mixtures. So when we look at the results, and part of the reason for conducting this forage survey is, one, producers don't do a lot of forage testing on pasture, and they don't do a lot of testing of their pasture water. So we wanted to find out what the quality was. And also a few speakers at some of our meetings over the last couple of years have really highlighted the copper and micro mineral deficiencies in our Canadian cattle herds. So the average dry matter 39%, crude protein of 11, and an average TDN or energy of 59. So this, for the most part, would meet a late lactation cow's requirements. But 58 of the pastures were actually below the protein requirement of 9.9%, and only 33% of the pastures would have adequate energy. So even though the average was pretty good, when we look at the individual pastures, the majority of them wouldn't meet the protein or energy requirements. So when it comes to protein and energy, the native pasture had the lowest overall protein at 9 and an energy of 57.6. So not surprising, generally native pasture is a little lower in quality. The tame grass had the highest protein of 13.3 and 59.4 TDN. Compared that to the grass legume of 12% protein and 60% TDN. So in general, the vegetative regrowth had the highest feed quality. That young regrowth that's 3 to 4 inches tall is like rocket fuel. It's really good protein, really good energy, but there's just not a lot of volume to that young regrowth for the most part. And then the mature forage, we had a number of pastures that were stockpiled. They hadn't been grazed at all. So by mid-August to mid-September, some of that forage is getting quite mature, and so then the quality drops off. Regarding calcium and phosphorus, calcium is the most abundant mineral in an animal's body, at 98% versus 80% of the phos. So calcium was highest on the grass legume, phosphorus of 22% or 0.22%, and then it was lowest in the native pastures. Part of the take home is all of the pastures met the calcium requirements except for a late gestation cow, all but one of the pastures. But 83% of the native pastures didn't meet the phosphorus requirement compared to 30% of the tame grass and grass legume. So calcium requirements for the most part met on pasture, but on the native pastures, the phosphorus wasn't being met. So usually we find higher calcium in our legumes, lower in our grass forage, and the lowest in the native forage. So there's two types of copper deficiency. One is primary copper deficiency when cows are not receiving adequate levels of copper. There's secondary copper deficiency is when copper is being bound in the rumen by other minerals, and sulfates, molybdenum, or iron can bind copper in the rumen. And we have many areas in Western Canada that are low in copper, including in Manitoba. Our Almasippi soils are renowned to be low in copper and zinc. So then the forages growing on those fields will be low in those microminerals, and it impacts annual crop production as well as perennial forage production. We also have soils that are high in molybdenum, and then we have high sulfates in feed such as kochia or canola or DDGs or some polycrops. So what are the signs of copper deficiency? If you have a black-hided animal, you can get that reddish tinge in the hair, so that's fairly obvious. You can have impaired reproductive performance. If you have higher open cow rates, you can have poor growth, unthriftiness, low weaning weights, and it can affect the immune system. When we're dealing with copper deficiency, it's not just as simple as increasing the copper in the ration, that's part of it. But when we have these antagonists, it can bind up that copper in the rumen, so then we have to look at other remedies such as using chelated minerals. Some of the sources of sulfur in an animal's diet include high-quality alfalfa. Alfalfa can have higher sulfur levels. DDGs, there's sulfur used in the fermentation process. DDGs are higher in sulfur, molasses are high in sulfur, and then we can have water sources that can be a high source of sulfur. So these will all impact copper absorption in the rumen. So what were the copper results on pasture in our survey this year? At an average of 3.85 ppm, all the pastures were low in copper. It didn't matter if it was tame, it didn't matter if it was native, it didn't matter if it had a legume in there, and it didn't matter where in the province these pastures were, because we sampled in central, we sampled in eastern, interlake, and northwest. All the pastures were low in copper. The ration requirement is 10 milligrams per kilogram, which is the same as 10 ppm. And then if we have higher sulfur or molybdenum, these requirements go up. The maximum concentration that we like to see in the ration, no more than 40, because too much copper can cause toxicity. So there wasn't much difference whether it was native grass was just over 3 ppm to tame grass at just over 4, and grass legume was about 4.5. The take-home message, all the pastures were below the minimum copper requirement. So what about molybdenum? If we have less than 2 ppm molybdenum, then a ration containing 10 milligrams of copper per kilogram of dry matter is adequate. If the molybdenum is higher, then we have to up that copper level. The molybdenum that we found on the pasture on average is 3.43 on all the pastures. The highest in the grass legume was 4.2, and the native grass had the lowest at an average of 2.4. The overall highest pasture was 11.7 parts per million. 51% of the pastures were over 2 ppm molybdenum. So over half the pastures had molybdenum that would cause copper to be tied up in the livestock. So then we have to look at overcoming this with a chelated mineral or using minerals with higher copper levels. So not only do we have low copper, but we also have a lot of molybdenum in the feed on the pastures. When it comes to zinc, zinc's important for growth rate, skin conditions, reproduction, and then the utilization of different nutrients. Recommended allowance is 30 milligrams per kilogram of dry matter or 30 ppm in the ration. The overall average on pasture in all the pastures and all the samples was 19.74. And all the pastures were below the minimum zinc requirement except one. So now not only do we have low copper, we have low zinc in our pasture forages. So just to summarize the pasture results, due to low copper and zinc levels on pasture, mineral supplementation is important. Inconsistent free choice consumption can make this difficult. We want to use a mineral with higher levels of copper and zinc will help ensure livestock intake is adequate, or a chelated blend, and read the label. There is a big variation in the level of copper that's supplemented in some of the minerals. By placing mineral out more regularly, we'll encourage consumption when the mineral is fresh and more palatable. Mixing salt can encourage consumption, but if there's saline areas on the pasture, the cattle may not be eating much additional salt. And around a lot of the lakes in Manitoba, we do have salinity issues. And we want to use mineral tubs that cover the mineral so it helps prevent weathering. It keeps it palatable. Low protein was a concern on a lot of these pastures, with 58% not meeting a late lactation cow's requirements, and almost 2/3 of the pastures were low in energy. So this means supplementation may be required, or better managing our forages through rotational grazing to keep the forages more vegetative, and it will improve the quality. If we can force feed mineral with the grain or silage, it will help to ensure that the copper levels are topped up in the liver before the cattle go to pasture. And this is especially important prior and during the breeding season. So Dr. John Campbell spoke at our beef days last week, and he highlighted the importance of copper deficiencies and how to test and then supplement for it. So he reviewed some of the work that was done through the Western Canadian and Canadian cow-calf surveillance through 2012 to 2022. And the blood testing work showed that in Western Canada in 2014, 43% of the animals were deficient in copper, with at least one animal being deficient at 92%. In 2016, 24% of the animals were deficient. And in 2019, 29% of the animals were deficient. But at least 63% of the cows had less than adequate serum copper. In Eastern Canada, there wasn't as much of a deficiency found. So these findings just back up what we found in the pasture survey this year of the copper deficiency that's occurring across Manitoba and Western Canada. Dr. Campbell talked about testing for copper, taking blood samples versus liver. Liver is the main storage for copper. Blood levels of copper tend to remain near normal until the liver is depleted. So the liver biopsy is the gold standard. That's the best way to determine the copper levels in your cows. It tells you what the copper status is more accurately. Blood sampling is easier to do and better than not testing. But if they're deficient on blood, they're very deficient. Basically, the liver is empty. When it comes to supplementation, we usually supplement with inorganic minerals, so are non-chelated. Blends contain usually a combination of organic, chelated, as well as non-chelated. And the reason for going with blends is a cost consideration is usually less. So if the antagonists such as sulfur, iron, and molybdenum are low, we can stick to the 10 ppm copper per kilogram of dry matter in the ration. But if we have some sulfur in the ration, if we have molybdenum above 2 ppm, then we want to increase how much copper we're supplementing and look at using chelated minerals. Some work done at the Western College of Veterinary Medicine that Dr. Campbell talked about was free choice versus force feeding. If cows are force-fed mineral for 3 months before calving, they're 6 times more likely to have adequate copper at calving compared to the free choice group. Cows force-fed came into heat 2 times faster and became pregnant 5 days earlier than cows fed free choice. And pre-calving supplementation is more effective than post-calving. And by force feeding, we're talking about including it in with the grain or silage where we know everyone's consuming the adequate amount of mineral, and it's not free choice where consumption can be variable depending on the animal. There is an injectable trace mineral that is available. We want to test the herd to ensure that there's a deficiency. It can be quicker fix pre-breeding, but too much can be toxic. So you need to talk to your vet before you use something like an injection. So while we were doing the pasture forage testing, we also tested the pasture water quality. There was a total of 39 samples that were tested by ALS in Winnipeg. When we look at the results, we sampled 17 dugouts with direct access. We had 4 dugouts that were fenced and 18 wells. Overall, the fenced dugouts had the best quality water, and the well water was the lowest quality. And even dugouts that had direct access was better than the wells. And part of the reason for that probably in 2024 was we had a lot of rain. So that helped provide a lot of fresh water into those dugouts. When we look at sulfates, the maximum is 1,000 that we like to see. Water above 1,000 can cause diarrhea and contribute to copper deficiencies. Sulfates more than 150 milligrams per liter can have a noticeable taste, while above 500 can have a laxative effect, and above 500 can tie up copper. So the sulfates were the lowest in the fenced dugouts and the highest in the wells. And 1 dugout and 4 wells were above 500, so about 13%, and about 8% or 3 wells were above the 1,000. Regarding total dissolved solids, below 1,000 is excellent. Below 3,000 is suitable for all classes of cattle. Once it gets to 5,000 to 7,000, it's considered poor quality and can cause diarrhea. And all of the water samples were below 3,000 except for 1 well. And we had 1 well that was super high in sulfates and total dissolved solids, as well as some of the other minerals. High levels of nitrogen, nitrates, or phosphorus can indicate contamination by farm waste, agricultural fertilizers, or livestock, and cattle going directly into dugouts. They add nutrients to it. This can stimulate algae and other aquatic plants. We don't like to see nitrate and nitrogen above 100, and all the water samples are below this. So at least we didn't see the high nutrient levels, and the fenced dugouts had the lowest nitrogen, and the wells had the lowest phosphorus levels. When it comes to metals, iron above 0.5 is acceptable for cattle, but tastes bad. 46% of the samples were below this, so almost half of our wells were below the iron threshold. Molybdenum shouldn't be above 0.05, and none of the water samples were above this level. And 1 milligram is the maximum copper level for cattle, and all samples were lower than this. So just to summarize, the overall water quality was actually pretty good for the cattle in most of the samples tested. Above average rainfall in 24 kept the dugout levels higher and was likely a factor in better water quality in the direct access dugouts. Versus if it's dry, droughty, the dugout levels get lower and nutrients can become concentrated. Where water sources are high in sulfates, which ties up copper, producers should be looking at a micromineral supplementation so that it's adequate. Use of chelated minerals or minerals with higher copper levels. Fenced dugouts had the best water quality overall, but direct access was better than a lot of the well water. By excluding livestock from the water source, quality is improved. But if dugouts are designed properly, have a hard bottom, if it's a gravel bottom, if they have vegetation to act as a buffer, the water quality can be suitable for cattle. And I'd like to thank all the participants. And if there's any questions, we have a few minutes for that.
No questions have been posted, Shawn.
Okay, well, thanks, Pam. So I'd like to thank all our speakers today for joining us for January edition of Stock Talk. I'm just gonna pull up a different screen here for a second.
Shawn, if you just select the from current slide, it should pull up on the one that you have highlighted.
Okay. So our next stock talk is February 13th. We will have a mass forage insurance and livestock insurance update, as well as a cattle market update. And then March 13th, Ask the Vet and the Western Canadian cow-calf survey results. And then April 10th, we will look at native pasture management and range pasture health. So that concludes today's stock talk. I'd like to thank you for joining, and I hope you'll join us next time on February 13th. Thank you.